There we go. That would have been bad. Joe would have got mad at me for that one. Cool. So this one will be on neuroplasticity, macrodosing Iboga for spiritual growth and neuroplasticity. And as always, we will start, we'll get to the reciprocity in a second, but this time we're going to do it in a little bit of a study style. So our hypothesis is basically what we're saying is, hey, if you macrodose with Iboga and you pair this with a constant psychological or spiritual practice, you're going to drive lasting changes in the brain, right? That's what we're assuming. But you know, a hypothesis must be proven. And so if we can prove that, then the next question becomes what practices are best for that? And we'll go to that at the end, yeah? And then this is sort of just the outline. And this is just a really beautiful picture. We're gonna talk about reciprocity, but I saw this and it really examples what's happening in Gabon right now. I just thought this was a really powerful image of really what colonization and really capitalism has done to Africa. And so right now we're doing a project in probably the most important project we've actually ever been a part of. On the left is my spiritual father, Gekado. This man, if you were to go up to him and say, hey, like, I have, I don't know, this lump that showed up on my arm, he would go into the jungle and find you something that would make it go away. He's a witch doctor is another way to say it. There's other words for it. In this tradition specifically, there's no shaman necessarily. It's gangas, different levels. And then you become a father. He is the father of the village. And then in the middle on the right is Mube Buel, who's his older brother and is literally the most powerful, I guess let's call him shaman in all of Africa. This is Mube in the center. And these are all the Gangas. Next to the left, you'll see the two white guys. In between them is a woman, her name's Makonza, and that's Papa Gekado's wife. But village Asika is the village of Mube and Gekado, who's on the left here. And if you ever, yeah, I mean, just look at the picture of him, you can tell there's a depth for sure with that dude. And so what we're trying to do with them is what's happening right now is that the same way you saw that image of Africa sort of getting consumed, the villages out there, specifically this village, is being consumed by the city. And although there could be benefits and pros and cons to everything, what's happening is the boys, which you're seeing in this picture, who spent their life in these traditions, are now having access to the cities. They're going in, and then the Western temptations are essentially pulling them away. And if you have to remember, the Bwiti is an oral tradition. And so this isn't something you can write down and then someone else could pick it up later. You have to be there to receive it orally. And these boys are the ones who pass it on to each other and going on and on and on. So what's actually happening is not only is Iboga being overpoached, but the Bwiti tradition itself is being destroyed. And so what my father Gekado wants to do is he wants to buy land off in the jungle and build a traditional village that's away from the city. Right now, when they go to the village, you have to go down a road. There's some houses built. They're really run down houses, but still you have to walk through people to get to the forest. And that wasn't the case before. And so what they're trying to do is build it out into the forest where you're covered and surrounded by medicinal plants. And then, want to plant Iboga trees. And then this is what we really want to help drive going forward year after year, is help the development of this. And so if anyone can support, we're going to be sending out like flyers. We already have it up on our website, but we're trying to raise 15. It's 12,500, just so you know, for the actual land. And then there's fees and stuff that go with it. And then we're also going to help support every year with helping the development of that. And then anyone who donates, when there's a tree, when we get the land and we plant Iboga trees, we're going to clip your name around one of the trees with the little tag. I think Joe's working on it right now. So if you think the picture's moving around, I apologize about that. But that's what we're doing. It's probably, in my humble opinion, this is probably the most important thing around Iboga or Bwiti I'm ever going to be a part of. We in the West will never know the Bwiti like they do. But the best thing we can do is not just help Iboga, which Blessing the Forest is doing, but preserve the actual culture around it, the tradition around it. And so we're calling it the Cultural Preservation Project, and it's where we're shifting everything. And so, if you can support, amazing. If you want to chat with me first, please reach out. Anything literally will help with this. And And yeah, I have some Iboga groups I'm a part of with some people who run Ibogaine clinics, and I'm trying to set up conversations. I'm trying to raise way more than this, but that's the target, just to get them the land. So at least we can know that they have the freaking land. I put some videos in this one just because I've been learning how to use Canva. So microdosing Iboga for spiritual growth and neuroplasticity. The first thing we have to ask is what is spiritual growth? Of course, I'm sure if we each defined it, we'd have our own definition. So sometimes the easiest thing to talk about what it's not, right? And that's called apophatic teaching. It's not something you say. It's not something you do. It's not measured by outer actions. It's not about becoming someone else. And it's not about the pursuit of extraordinary experiences. And so whenever I hear the word psychedelic, I'm actually talking about this last one. There's a difference between psychedelic, plant medicine, and plant teachers. And I think it's a really nice thing if we start to use the right vocabulary for what we're speaking about. And so a definition I found of spiritual growth is an ongoing process of transforming one's inner life to develop a deeper connection to a higher power, greater purpose, or divine reality, leading to increased self-awareness, transformation, and the cultivation of virtues like presence and love. That's beautiful. It's really incredible. But when you start to really break this down and look at the definition, there's some key words in there that stand out. To develop a deeper connection, a higher power. If you just say higher power, most people make a gesture outward. A greater purpose, leading to, or the cultivation. These are all words that require sort of a movement away or a movement towards something. And for me personally, when I think about spirituality, I don't think of any movement. I think of something that's already there. And so I went back and I looked at what's the word of what does spiritual mean and what does growth mean? Like, what's it from? And if you look at this Latin word, breath, essence, or life force for spiritual, and for growth, we have to flourish, to come into being. And so what we could say is, just by picking two of those, is that spiritual growth is the essence of being. In that, there's no movement. There's nowhere to go. There's nothing to change. There's nothing to become or strive for. And so I just wanted to say that we're going to use this sort of definition because it's more applicable to what we're doing. But I just want to be clear that just remember, spirituality is what you innately are. You don't have to eat plant medicine for it. You don't have to work on your traumas for it. You're innately that. And it's important that we all sort of just remember that as we go forward. Carl Jung talks about this in his own way. This is a quote Jo uses. She loves this quote. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. And what he's really talking about isn't heaven or hell, which is a movement towards, right, which we talked about. What he's saying is about this point in the middle, this point of balance. And when you go to something like the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and you hear about their afterlife stories, I have this tattoo on my arm, but what they say is when you enter the afterlife, they're going to put your heart on one side of the scale, and they're going to put the feather of Ma'at on the other side. And the translation in the Book of the Dead is that if your heart is as light or lighter than the feather, you will go to the afterlife. If your heart is heavier than the feather, it's like a version of hell. And I forgot the name of this beast, but he'll devour your heart. But I know what the translations say, but if you guys look at this, it looks to me like this scale is balanced. And I think there's significance in that gets overlooked sometimes when we try to translate things other than just look at the freaking obvious nature of something. They're talking about balance. Your heart being as light as a feather. In other words, equanimity or balance. Same thing Jung was talking about. These are my crazy notes from studying the Sutras of Patanjali. But Patanjali teaches that there's these three forces: sattva, rajas, and tamas: tranquility, activity, and inertia. And when these three things are in perfect balance, matter is unaffected. And we're in what we call the unmanifest, or no thing, which Eckhart Tolle calls it. If any of these three things are off balance, matter forms, and this gives rise to the concrete world. So again, we're talking about when we have a state of balance, we're talking about the state the state of equilibrium. The potential for creation exists, but the material universe has not yet manifested. So you're talking about the potential for creation. That sounds a lot like what we're talking about when we talk about God or spirit or all of these things. And so it's just interesting that in the Yoga Sutras, they also talk about balance in their own way. The Bwiti have a word for that. It's called Inzenzen. It's the perfect center point, the very dead center between all polarities. The Buddha called it the middle way, and Eckhart Tolle calls it the deep eye, the transcendental dimension. And so I just wanted to name this, that to me, spirituality is this. It's something beyond movement. It's something that doesn't require change. It's the thing that allows the potential for change. So through the lens of neuroplasticity, we're exploring how working with Iboga at a macrodose scale supports the recognition and remembering of our essence of simply being, not as something to reach, but as what has always been there. So this is going to be our now working definition going forward. Yeah, I just want to make sure we walk through this. So microdosing Iboga. So let's talk about Iboga. You guys all know this slide. Iboga is the root bark, and then that's the full spectrum plant. The analogy we always give, it's like the rainbow, and then Ibogaine is like the color red. That's the easiest way to sort of frame it and understand it. And you know, Ibogaine, a lot of people don't know, it comes from Vocanga africana as well. If you're going to a clinic, chances are 99% of the Ibogaine you're getting is probably going to be from Vocanga africana. It's not actually coming from Iboga because Vocanga has a higher yield. There's about like 10 to 12% Ibogaine when Iboga has about 5% max. And that's like on a really, really strong plant. And so just remember, Iboga is not about Ibogaine. It's about all the alkaloids coming together to create something very holistic and very special for you. This is why I always tell people, if you have a choice, if you need to go to Ibogaine to get detox, go do that. But if you have a choice, come work with the whole rainbow. And so let's talk about macrodosing versus microdosing. We did a call before on microdosing. We're going to touch into that just a tiny bit, but microdosing is sub-perceptual. And it's really about sort of like a gentle support mechanism that you're using in the background of your life to drive some sort of change. A macrodose is perceptual. And as you're going to see, that can mean a lot of things, right? And one thing to remember, if you're macrodosing, it requires more preparation and a safe container. Microdosing, you can microdose. I'm not advocating this. You can microdose and go do something. Macrodosing, depending on where you're at, you should be very cautious with that. And again, we'll talk about that. This is just a picture of the microdosing protocol we have in case anyone needs it. I can also email this to you or text it to you if you need it. And so this is the image right here that shows essentially what is the difference between microdosing here at the bottom and macrodosing. What I've found from most of the people we work with is about 250 milligrams or less is typically sub-perceptual. It depends. Women obviously are more receptive. They're more sensitive than men a lot of times, not all in all cases, but a lot of times. And so sometimes for women, this could be a lower number. But in general, about less than or equal to 250 milligrams is about a microdose. And everything above that is a macrodose, which opens the question, well, what are these layers above that? I put this slide in here because I just, some people say, is microdosing really helping me? And this isn't about psychedelics or plant medicine or Iboga. This is about a test they did where they hooked up a pulse generator to the vagus nerve of individuals who are learning Mandarin Chinese. And what they did was, as they were taught tones, they stimulated this in a sub-perceptual manner so they couldn't notice. And what they found was that the easier tones that people were learning, people who had the stimulation happen learned these faster. And for the harder tones, it didn't have an effect. But the point getting is sub-perceptual input creates a neuroplastic state, a neuroplastic window, right? And this isn't about plants or ingesting anything. This is just about the stimulation to the vagus nerve. When you ingest Iboga in a microdose, you're stimulating not just the vagus nerve, but your entire nervous system. And so the point I'm showing with this slide is that sub-perceptual input has an effect on neuroplasticity. You don't have to feel it to generate neuroplasticity. But what we're concerned about in this call is the macrodose range. And so when you go into the perceptual realm, there's these different layers that I've sort of identified over the years. There's the macrodose sort of for personal use. And if you look here, there's a microdose for personal use. There's a macro for personal use, about 250 to 800 milligrams is about that. And then there's the macrodose for therapeutic use. There's about 800 milligrams to 2 grams. Some of you, I don't know if anyone's on the call I've done this with, but what some people do is they'll take around 2 grams And then what we do is about a 2.5 hour, I don't call it a therapy session, we call it a psychospiritual session. And then we get on Zoom. You take the medicine about 2 hours before the call starts. And then I jump on the call with you and we basically go into a bunch of shit. And so that's one of the things we do with the therapeutic range. This is actually what I want to do. This is the reason why I'm getting my doctorate in clinical psychology, is to start actually implementing this in a therapeutic model, working in this specific range. And then there's a ceremony range, which is what we do at the retreats. When you come to our retreat for our level 1, which is the first time you work with us, I'm basically dosing you within this range. There's very few people the first time where I dosed them outside of that. When I trained, people were constantly being dosed outside of that. And what I found is that if you can stick in this range, it's much more workable. There's a lot more ability to navigate, and we'll talk about the real reason why it's so important in a minute. The next level up from that is what we do in our level 2 program. So our level 2, I'm basically just dosing you between 21 and 40. There's a whole different type of, not depth of the experience, because once you're in, and we'll talk about that. But the reason this is the time and the space, and you'll see later why the amount of time you're in, I'm going to say psychedelic experience, determines the depth of the critical window you have afterwards. And so we'll get to that. Just remember that. And then the last range I call is the Africa range, which the Bwiti do. This range, there's really no reason to go above this unless you're in Gabon. And that's in full transparency. And I've taken more than this amount by myself, like here. And I've taken, now the most I've taken, just so you guys know, is 100 grams. And it's a lot. And I did that in Africa. And it's the only place I would say do that, because the way that the container is created in Gabon is so vastly different from anything you're ever going to find anywhere else. This is the amount you have to basically do these larger amounts. And I can't tell you why, but if you went to go there, you would know. And so just know that in our retreats, we're working in this macrodose range. But for the purpose of our call, we're talking about any of basically this personal use, this therapeutic use, the ceremony use, or the flood level. Any of these ranges, everything in here in perceptual, you're going to get the introspection of Iboga that it offers you. So if you take a macrodose, you're going to have the introspective qualities. If you move it up a little bit into this therapeutic range, the ceremonial and the flood, you're going to get the psychospiritual or psychosomatic qualities that come with it. And then again, this area is reserved for the Bwiti and the Bwiti alone. It's something you have to experience for yourself. But on my last initiation, they served me 4 servings. And it was about, and I know this because I serve it, so I have an idea how much. It was about 25, if not more, grams each serving. And yeah, and you don't get any hands, and you don't get to have any water. So for all you people who come to a retreat, you get to a piece of watermelon after. Yeah, it's a luxury. You definitely don't get that out there. And so why is that important to know? Because there's a threshold, which I call the stimulant threshold. Obviously, Iboga is a stimulant. We all know that. But there's a threshold where it will keep you up, essentially. When you're working in these ranges from essentially 2 grams and below, you can fall asleep at night if you take it like at night, you can fall asleep the next day. If you take it in the morning, you'll fall asleep at night. When you start getting above 2 grams, what you're doing is putting yourself in the stimulant zone. And why that's important is because you enter the zone of no sleep. And this is important because the more amount you have, the longer it takes you to drop into this sleep zone down here, into this 2 grams and below range. And so one of the things I observed was that when I first started, people were getting so much medicine. The very first time they touched it, they were getting put up into these ranges up here, and they're not sleeping for multiple days. And if you think about the psyche of an individual coming to Iboga who's never had it, who's dealing with trauma, and let's say you're walking into a retreat that's talking a lot about trauma, there's a tremendous pressure there. Now you're adding no sleep on top of that. That's not a recipe for wellness. That's a recipe for re-traumatization, to be quite honest with you. And so the more medicine you take doesn't necessarily make you go deeper. If you want to go the deepest with Iboga, you can only find it here. I could give you 40 grams and I could give you 10 grams, and you could have a full-blown visionary journey. It's not going to matter. The difference in depth with Iboga only happens when you're immersed in the ceremony itself in Gabon, And like I said, that's something you're going to have to experience with your own two eyes because it is different. It's a collective heartbeat that you're living in, and it will change you, but that's the only place you're going to find it. Yeah. And so again, the importance of that is when you have a tremendous amount of medicine, it might take you 3 days before you drop into the zone where you fall asleep. I just was out there. I was awake for 3 days in a vision. And the word that I heard recently that explains it best is a visionary coma. My first initiation, I was in it for 5 days. And some of you know that story with no sleep. Nobody needs that. It's not necessary. 2 days is a lot for people to handle psychologically. And so this is why we're working in this range, why I'm so specific about dosing. It's why I have a spoon that measures right around 3 grams, because I know if I give you 7 spoons, I'm giving you right at 21 grams. And so it's really important to just know this as you go forward. If you're going to macrodose, whether it's with us or someone else, just understand that this is really what happens. There is no deeper with Iboga outside of the bone. Yeah. And so now let's get into the neuroplasticity side of this. So what we've done so far is we've talked about the different types of macrodosing, just to make sure we have awareness of it. And now we're going to talk about the neuroplasticity portion. I know we throw around this term a lot, but there's 2 types of neuroplasticity. There's structural and functional. Structural neuroplasticity is essentially how we learn, right? If you learn a new language, and just so you guys know, we're going to mail out this PDF. So just if you want to take notes, go ahead, but you're also going to get this PDF there issued. And I put all the DOIs of the white papers in there. So when you have the PDF, you can click them and read the paper yourself if you like. And so that's structural. It's just how we learn. And then there's functional neuroplasticity. This is really amazing because this is essentially how the brain adapts to injury or traumatic brain injury, we could say, right? Let's say a portion of the brain responsible for speech gets damaged. Well, through functional neuroplasticity and synaptic remodeling, the brain can find other ways to get its speech back. And of course, the definition of neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to recognize itself or reorganize, excuse me, by forming new neural connections throughout your life. Before we go any further, let's just take a real quick on the anatomy of what the neurons actually look like. So you have the nucleus of the neuron. We all, almost all of our cells have this, right? Some sort of control center. You have these things called dendrites, look like the roots of a tree. And the whole part here is called the cell body. This tail portion is the axon, which comes down. Around the axon is myelination. This is a cholesterol material that insulates the neuron. I'll talk about why. And then you have the presynaptic axon and the postsynaptic dendrite, which is this same thing up here. And so the way your neurons work is a chemical signal, something like serotonin, we all know that one, will come here to the dendrites. It will change the polarity inside of here. It will cause an electrical impulse to travel down the axon body. Once it gets to the end, it will stimulate a chemical response, which will then travel to the nucleus, send an electrical response, and so on and so on. For people with, example, with Parkinson's, what's happening is one thing that happens is the myelination's gone. And number 2 things that happen is these neurons that produce the dopamine start to degenerate. But if the myelination goes away and you send an electrical impulse down this axon body, the electrical impulse will get lost. It has no insulation. It's like trying to transfer heat without an insulation around the tube. It's going to dissipate into the environment. And so the myelination is crazy, crazy important. You're going to see later, and we've talked about this before, Iboga actually repairs myelination. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is just a general idea of how this thing works, just so you guys know as we talk forward. When we say like, you know, we're growing new dendrites, you're going to know that this is what we're talking about, these pieces up here. This is a video. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. This is literally what happens inside your brain. This is fucking amazing. So that's essentially neuroplasticity. And so how does it work? I thought about breaking it down with photos, but it would be basically a course we'd have to take. But basically what's happening is you have some sort of trigger. Dopamine, It could be an emotion, and we'll talk about this picture to the right in a second to sort of simplify it. The neurons start to fire. This is called the Hebbian tagging. If you ever heard Joe Dispenza say neurons that fire together, wire together, he basically got that from this man, Hebbian, who was a researcher. Now you have fast synaptic tuning, which is, you can think of it like a highway starting to form in your brain, right? Neurons that fire together, wire together, so they start getting used at the same time. And so you have this highway start to form. The other analogy is that you have a snow-covered mountain and you ride down it on a sled and it makes a track. And you ride down again and again and again. Now the track starts to form. Once that happens, you're going to start activating these genes, BDNF, GDNF. We've talked about these before. BDNF is brain-derived neurotropic factors, and GDNF are glial cell line-derived neurotropic factors. These are the things that are essentially responsible for your brain health. We're going to talk about the BDNF and gene activation later. There's actually something else very cool about it. And then you have this gap of structural growth, which goes for about 6 to 72 hours. This is when you have the spines and the synapses start to grow. And if we just go back to the anatomy of the neuron, here's the synapses down here. Network rebalancing. This is when the myelination occurs. So now, not only does they fire together, wire together, they start to myelinate. This is why if you look at our menu, we have a bunch of foods like avocados, eggs, we have salmon on the menu. You have to have these cholesterols and these healthy fats in order to feed the system. So there actually is an Iboga diet. People don't know that, but that's why a lot of people are hungry for meat when you have Iboga. It's actually your body craving these sort of proteins that actually make the neuroplasticity happen. And then one of the most important pieces is the sleep consolidation. And this is when the synaptic pruning comes in. We'll talk about that in a minute. We won't worry about it right now, but sleep is key for the medicine, which going back to why you do not want to be up for multiple days, because sleep is what puts it all together. And I'll overlay this schedule later over a retreat flow, so you'll get an idea of like what's happening. Then there's the automation. This is when the cerebellum sort of comes into play and starts automating tasks. We're going to talk about that later. The critical window, which you might have heard, is sort of basically like your prime learning opportunity, how to change your life, is a critical window. And then you have the use it or lose it phase, which like for myself, I used to speak Portuguese when I worked down there as a chemist, and I barely know like 4 words now. You use it or lose it. It's as simple as that, right? And there's a beauty to that as well too. Now, how does this translate to our lives? This is a graphic Joe and I created for a course we teach on basically like liberating your mind. But what we say is the same thoughts that you have are going to lead to the same choices. The same choices you have are going to lead to the same actions and behaviors. The same action behaviors are going to lead to the same experiences, and the same experiences are going to lead to the same feelings. And the same feelings are going to lead to the same thoughts. And round and round and round you're going to go. And that is essentially what's happening in this process. This is why it's so critical to have integration support after working with Iboga. If you're going to be macrodosing, you have to be doing the right things, and we're going to end our presentation with those things. So a second ago, we talked about the cerebellum getting activated, and I've used this analogy before, but when you learn how to drive, the first time you get behind the car, if you're like me, you're like, what the hell is going on? I almost crashed it. And actually, my first car I got was stick shift, and I made my dad return it because I literally couldn't drive. I was just like, I'm just not going to have a car. Forget it. And so the first time you probably got behind the wheel, you're like, I don't know what's going on. There's a lot of things happening. And now, probably when you drove home from work today or wherever you came from, you probably didn't have to think about it. Well, the question is why? And this isn't, the way I've framed this isn't really about the synaptic growth in this process of the neuroplasticity. What I'm really talking about here is more the functional neurology behind it. And so what's actually happening, and when you first learn to drive, is your prefrontal cortex is activating. You have this higher processing system of the brain, this higher thinking mind that takes a lot of energy. You have different parts of the brain, the parietal motor cortex, you have the anterior cingulate cortex. All these parts are responsible when you first learn to drive. And then as you start to get skilled, these start to consolidate. If you remember, there's a consolidation piece that happens in sleep. So you drive, you have this neuroplasticity happening, these different parts of the brain start to form, you have these new pathways being created, you sleep, and now what happens is the skills get refined. They start to move their way down to the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. You have a reduction in the activity of the frontal cortex, this is proven, and the myelination of the neural pathways occurs, which, as you know now, what the myelination is. And then in the advanced stage of driving, you don't even have to think about it. What's really happening is this part down here, this green piece circled with this big black mark, is called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is essentially automating these tasks. And so the course Joe and I teach, the premise we have with Iboga is what happens with our lives is suffering is like driving. At first, suffering is something it's hard to do. We experience it as kids, and over time, through trauma, through abuse, through whatever, what's happening really at its core is we are bringing that and compartmentalizing it down to the basal ganglia. So suffering becomes an automated thing in our lives. We basically become conditioned to suffer. And so the course we teach is about how to decondition that. And this, what we're talking about here, is essentially the same thing, right? So what is an example of structural plasticity? Remember, this is how you learn. In London, there's a test. This is a research that was done. And here's the DOI. Like I said, when you get this, you can just click that. It'll take you to the paper. There's a study done. And what they did was the drivers who are taxi drivers in London have to take this test called the knowledge. And it's a memorization test of all of this down here, which looks crazy if you just think about that. Like, I don't want to study this. And what they did was they looked at the brains of the taxi drivers in London, and they looked at the brains of people who aren't taxi drivers in London. And what they found was across the board that the posterior hippocampus, which is the part of the brain associated with spatial memory and navigation, was largest in taxi drivers. And what that's saying, why it's important, is that repeated meaningful practices change the structure of the brain. That's structural plasticity, right? This is the premise of what we're going to be talking about later. But I just want to give you an example of what structural plasticity is and to show that it works and it's objective. And what I mean by that is you can teach the brain to memorize something like this. You can teach the brain to speak another language. You can teach the brain to be kind to you, or you can teach the brain destructive patterns. And that's a double-edged sword of Iboga. So when someone says like, oh, if someone's serving Iboga, why are they so messed up? It's because they're not doing their personal work and they're eating Iboga. So the neuroplasticity is being activated in hyperdrive. And in their personal life, they're doing shitty things. And what's happening is it's forming this. And so just think about that. That is the double-sided sword of Iboga. If you don't have the space to really land after a ceremony, I will tell you not to come. I'm the first person. And it's for this reason. This is why Joe and I are so critical about the way we live our life, because we serve it, we're constantly consuming it. And so if we're not very careful, we run a very dangerous game of ingraining really bad habits and ways of being into our lives. And we do not want that. And I've seen that firsthand. An example of functional plasticity is very simple. It's strokes. We won't go through the whole slide, but in a stroke case, the brain reassigns jobs from damaged zones to healthy regions, or you can call it building a bypass. And this is just this technique, this paper, this is an overview paper, a literature review, and it shows different ways in which they can stimulate that process. But the point is, your brain has a capacity to do this. So now let's talk about neuroplasticity and psychedelics. This paper here was really, really cool. We're going to dive into this pretty deep. But the question what they asked was, do classical psychedelics work like ketamine by promoting plasticity in cortical neurons? And if so, how? And they looked at DMT, psilocin, LSD, MDMA, and they looked at Ibogaine. Now, I say psilocin because some people don't know this, and I think it's just important to know. Psilocybin is this molecule here on the left. When you ingest psilocybin, it goes through a process of dephosphorylation, which if you look here, this is just a phosphate group. If you look here, the phosphate group is gone, and it becomes psilocin. In the case of psilocybin, this is an inactive compound, and psilocin is the active compound. I know a guy who grows strains of mushrooms that are massively high in psilocin, and they come on super fast. They're crazy. But it's important to just know the designation between the two. This is the molecule that actually binds to the 5-HT2A receptor and gives you that experience. And then something interesting that a lot of people don't know is that Ibogaine goes through a similar process. So Ibogaine goes through a process when it comes into your liver, CPY2D6 enzyme metabolizes that, and it goes through a process of demethylation. So if you look here, there's a CH3 connected to this oxygen. Right here, it's gone. And so now it becomes noribogaine. And in fact, 90% of Ibogaine converts to noribogaine in 24 hours. And a beautiful part about that is that Ibogaine actually has a short shelf life. And noribogaine, excuse me, has a longer shelf life, about 28 to 49 hours. And so the cardiotoxic effects that are sort of lasting afterwards, and even the benefits that are really helping you for post-addiction at an Ibogaine clinic are happening because of noribogaine, right? And so just to understand that this is what's happening. The difference is Ibogaine is also an active compound, and so is noribogaine. Yeah, so it's just a cool little thing to know. And so what did they do in the study? What they did is they did sort of 3 tests. They did a test in dishes, in living systems, and then they went back and did a mechanism test and blocked some specific receptors. And if you see down here, the BDNF is the thing we talked about earlier, okay? So in dishes, what they did was they took different sets of neurons and they bathed them in different type of psychedelics, and they measured the growth, right? And then what they did in living systems, they gave rats DMT and looked at parts of the brain to see the growth. And then they also did them in other things like flies and a zebrafish as well. And then they did a mechanism test where they blocked certain receptors after administering psychedelics to see if that had a down chain effect, okay? So what they find in the cells, they found that most psychedelics tested, pretty much all we talked about, caused more branches to grow, more dendritic arbor complexity. They formed more spines, and they built more synapses, and those are the communication hubs. What was interesting is that when they tested Ibogaine itself, it showed no measurable plasticity effects in the dish model, which might be like, what the hell? But once they tested noribogaine, Ibogaine's metabolite, which we just talked about, if you remember, it's converting from Ibogaine to noribogaine. When they did that, they noticed that it was one of the strongest, actually. And so Ibogaine isn't even the thing that's really assisting in the neuroplasticity as much as Ibogaine is. Ibogaine has different functions. It promotes BDNF, GDNF, things like that. But the real neuroplasticity being driven is done by the noribogaine, which is interesting. So that's in cells. Now, what about the animals? And there's the pictures here if you want to see them. We're not going to dive into that too much. A single dose of DMT in rats boosted their dendritic spine density in the prefrontal cortex, right? And then this was comparable to ketamine, except it lasted longer. It also created more neuron signaling. And so if you remember, it's a chemical and electrical impulse that the neurons use to communicate. This increased. And then the rats also had behavioral improvements, right? And this better fear extinction, antidepressant-like effects. So basically saying it helps with mental health. And then what about the mechanism test? So what they did was they blocked this TRKB receptor. This is the receptor responsible for allowing the BDNF factors to be produced. And so what they did was they gave psychedelics and they watched everything grow, the plasticity happens. Then they gave psychedelics and they blocked this receptor and the plasticity effects went away, okay? They did the same thing with this mTOR receptor, which produces these growth proteins. They blocked that, the effects went away. They also blocked the 5-HT2A receptor. If you remember, I said psilocin binds to the 5-HT2A receptor. By the way, so does Ibogaine and noribogaine. And also the effects went away. And the reason why this is really important, because this reinforces the fact that during macrodosing, you have to have considerations to your diet. You have to, right? Amino acids, omega-3 fatty acid, magnesium, zinc, healthy cholesterols. These are all things you want to have in your diet if you're going to be macrodosing and microdosing. These are just summary findings we went over, and then this is definitions in case someone has a presentation and they didn't know what some of the words meant. So don't worry about those. Earlier, we talked about the production of myelination and why that's important. So this was a study done, a case study they did. Jonathan Dickinson's, one of the guy here, was actually initiated. He was the first person to initiate the village I just got initiated at. And so what they did was they looked at people with MS. And if you don't know, MS is a disease where the immune system attacks the myelin, the insulation around the nerves, which we've talked about, leading to lesions, inflammation, and loss of mobility or cognitive functions, right? And so this is a picture of healthy myelin, and this is a picture of damaged myelination. So before treatment, this person had mobility issues, bladder problems, memory issues, vertigo. And if you look here, I have it in red. Inside the red are the lesions in the brain scans. Very, very prominent. This person was given 1,200 milligrams of Ibogaine in a single flood dose with microdosing after. These two papers on the right sort of go back to what we're talking about. We're basically saying that proving that Ibogaine stimulates GDNF and BDNF, and it also helps repair myelination. That's all we're saying. I'm just showing you why this happened. So what happened with this person? 71% lesion shrinkage in just 3 months. That's friggin' amazing. If you think about that, you're literally talking about something that heals the friggin' physical brain down to that level. And then a 35% in the ADC values. These are just markers that measure inflammation damage. And he had clinical improvements, even to the point where he ended up running a 200-mile ultra marathon later. And we have photos of the after. I overlaid the exact same red circles, but look how small these lesions got basically on the inside in here. If you look down here, this is the first ones. Now here's the second ones. Look at the lesions at the bottom here. I tried to circle them in red. You can see they got way smaller, a 71% decrease. That is incredible stuff right there. And now we're going to go into the synaptic pruning portion. And so these papers basically looked at the role of glial cells and psychedelics in pruning and neurodevelopmental and degenerative disorders. So what is synaptic pruning? It's a process that involves the selective elimination of unnecessary or weak synaptic connections in the brain. When you hear the use it or lose it, this is what's actually happening. And so in my example of my Portuguese, I studied and I studied, I built these neural connections, these pathways, and then I stopped using it. And what happens is over time, my brain went in and snipped them all out. That's the pruning factor. This happens mostly between the ages of 2 and 10 and then the early 20s, which is why using drugs in this phase is like awful. But what's really happening is during this phase, when a child's 2 years old to 10, 50% of the synapses present at age 2 are fully eliminated through this pruning process. So it's a very significant process. A way to describe it is decluttering the house, right? It makes it easier to navigate your house because there's less things everywhere. Same thing's happening in the brain. Yeah. And so what the results showed was that obviously psychedelics produce these glial cells, the BDNF, the GDNF, and they play a role in the pruning and tagging synapses for elimination. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is important because remember we talked about how they blocked the mTOR receptors. The reason you see now why it caused the problem was because no pruning could be done. There's no elimination being done, so you can't proceed with neuroplasticity if nothing's being removed. Increase in BDNF and TOR growth factors that fuel both building and refining neural circuits. And then I'll just go to the bottom, that synaptic pruning is essential for maturing brain circuits. And then at the very bottom, the study showed that autism may be linked to insufficient pruning, and schizophrenia may be linked to excessive pruning, too many synapses, and epilepsy is part of that as well. And so we're just showing the value and the importance of synaptic pruning. It's a natural and healthy thing. And if we were to go back to our slide, we'd see that sleep is part of the way where this happens. So what's the timeline of neuroplasticity? This is the big question we really need to know. So according to this study, between 1 and 3 hours, those genes are turned on. And I'm going to show you a map of this in a second. Around 6 hours, the neurons start sprouting new branches and spines start to build. 24 to 72 hours is really essential. This is the peak growth window. This is when the synaptogenesis and the dendritogenesis, new connections and branches, are strongest here. And the example they give in the paper, or I give here, is wet clay. So this is when the clay is wet and you can actually mold it. And then when it tapers after about 5 days, and the lasting changes can go over a month, we'll talk about that. And so this is just a chart I put together to sort of model what it might look like. So if you see down here, we have this baseline activity of the neuroplasticity happening in your brain. Then you ingest something like a beautiful mushroom. What's going to happen between 0 to 6 hours, your genes are going to switch on. These are those BDNF and GDNF factors we were talking about. And remember, if we block those, we don't have neuroplasticity, so they're crucial. We see why they're important to the start. Now, new branches begin to form. Up at the top here, you see now we're entering this peak growth phase from 24 to 72 hours. These black lines represent the days. Okay. After that, we're going to have this closing window. We're going to start to come down. The growth rate is going to drop off, but the new growth will stay steady. Obviously, if you don't use it or lose it, it's going to drop off over time, but now you have this new growth in your brain. And these are the new branches that have stabilized. So that's sort of the process of how it works, just giving it sort of a visual representation of what's happening. And so now let's talk about one of the most important things is a critical period. So can psychedelics reopen the social reward learning circuit period in adults? And critical period is this special window of time in the development of the brain is extra open to learning certain things, like spiritual practices or self-realization, or to love yourself, or to trust yourself, or to forgive yourself. Substitute any of that into here. And so, yeah, basically this window is closed for adults, so it makes it difficult for us to rewire what's it's so hard for us to change, why we go to psychedelics in the first place. And so what they did in this study was they took mice, and I think this is just awesome. I mean, it's sad that mice are tested on, but if you think about like from the level of the soul, imagine the mouse who in the spiritual world is like, I'm going to sign up to be the mice who has a bunch of LSD. Like that's a pretty evolved mouse, I would say. It's kind of cool to think about it from that way. It sucks just like what they're doing. But so mice were given a dose of different drugs. Ibogaine was one of them. And they ran a social conditioning test. I won't go into the depth of the test, but essentially what they did was they put one cage with something they called the social reward and another cage that was neutral, right? And what they did was for every single psychedelic, they found that it opened the critical period window. Psilocybin, LSD, Ibogaine, ketamine, MDA all made adult mice behave like juveniles again. They learned to associate social interaction with reward, which is something adults don't do. It's interesting because there's a verse in the Bible that's really fascinating when you think about this part right here. And it's Matthew 18:3. And it says, truly I tell you, in order to enter the gates of heaven, you must be like that of a child. And so I think what the invitation there, in my opinion, is to go back to this state where we're finding reward in the simple things of life. Cocaine, by the way, they tested, didn't do this. And the duration of the open window differed by drug. Ketamine was 1 week, psilocybin 2 weeks, LSD, and Ibogaine was 4. I'm going to talk about this picture on the right on the next slide. It makes more sense. So on the top, what you're seeing right here are the subjective effects of each of these substances on humans. And on the bottom is the critical period that opened in mice. And what you find is an exact parallel, exact overlay parallel. And the reason this is important is because the longer the trip, the longer the brain wave stays open afterwards, or the brain state, the longer this sort of critical open period exists. And so you remember, if we go back to our slide where we're talking about taking more Iboga makes it last longer, that's the benefit of taking more Iboga. That's why we have a level 2 program, right? And so when you're taking these large amounts of these plants, you're making sure that critical window is open longer, which means you have to be more diligent about what you're doing afterwards. This is very important. This is why if you do level 2 with us, where we give you this large amount, you have to do 10 coaching sessions with me. It's for this exact reason, because if not, you might not be taking advantage of the critical window, and you might be teaching yourself something that's actually going to end up harming you, going back to that double-edged sword of Iboga. So what does this look like if you overlay it on top of a retreat sort of model, right? And so ceremony 1, you're ingesting the medicine around 10 p.m. So for the first 6 hours, you're having gene activation. That means from about 4 a.m. onward, for about 6 hours, you're in this massive growth phase, right? And so if you look here, going into 4 a.m., which would be the next day, if you look down here, there's this peak window 1. You are entering this peak window 1 around 4 a.m. And so if people ever wonder why at 4 a.m. or 3:30, I cut off the Bwiti music and I turn on the ayahuasca music and the lectures by Ram Dass or Alan Watts, now you're seeing why, because you're in a hyper neuroplastic state. And the number one thing you could probably do in that state, much as listening to Bwiti music is amazing, is also hear Ram Dass talk about beyond all polarities, I am. Let the judgments and opinions of the mind be the judgments and opinions of the mind, and you exist beyond that. Ah, soul. Stuff like that becomes hyper absorbed in these states. And so literally what we're doing is trying to condition you to have self-realization or to find more self-love or self-care. And so this happens around 4 a.m. and that's going to go until day 5, right when you start ceremony 2, actually. An interesting thing that I found, and I actually did not know this before that, is the synaptic pruning really begins in this period right here around day 4. And what's so interesting is that's right around the same time we do the spiritual shower. And if you think about the spiritual shower, it's about calling in the new things into your life, and more so about washing away the old things. And so when you think about that, you're actually doing this ritual of pruning on sort of a spiritual dimension, you could say, while your brain is entering this pruning state. It's actually really beautiful to see the balance in there. We have the integration circle, which helps with the reinforcing. And then on ceremony 2 day, you have the equine therapy. There's a solidification state, and you sort of repeat that same process going onward and outward. And the next slide, I'm going to show you sort of the extended time when you come home. But this is how it sort of overlays with a retreat model, the way we have it designed. And for those who haven't been here for a while, yeah, we added equine therapy. We have a horse ranch across the street where we take you to now. It's freaking incredible. And so, yeah, this is post-retreat, right? So what's happening? So days 5 to 7, I call this the do less phase. This is basically the peak growth phase is still happening, and the brain's highly, highly impressionable. This is why if someone says, what do I do after the retreat? I say, stay in Costa Rica and don't do anything. Just sit in nature. Literally don't do anything if you can, right? The best place really to do is go up to the hot springs in the volcano town, in my opinion. Day 8 to 7 is called the anchoring phase. The window's still open. You're more stable than the first week, but now your brain is really the rewiring starting to happen. So this is when you really want to dive into your practice. And we'll talk about this in a moment. Oh, the baby just hit her head on something. If you could hear, I apologize. The anchoring phase is really, really important. A really beautiful book for this is Breaking the Bad Habit of Being Yourself by Dr. Joe Dispenza. That is an incredible, incredible book to read. Even if you've read it in this phase. It works, dude. It helps with the analytical side with all the science, and he has the practices built in. And then from 15 to 30, you have the reinforcement phase. And remember, Iboga is lasting the longest. So it's keeping this plasticity going up to about 4 weeks. And this is the sweet spot for the deep, deep training. So really, after the retreat, these first 30 days are your money zone to change your life, especially with Iboga. And then you have the maintenance and growth phase at the end. The acute phase is closed, but the new circuits is formed. And you really want to stay with a steady discipline practice. Usually, if you can keep up a spiritual practice or some sort of practice after Iboga for 30 days, you're going to be settled in after that. And in our integration packet, our workbooks we have stuff that helps you after this. And when we send this email out, I'll make sure there's a link to that. It's about like 40 pages of integration stuff, really, really cool stuff. And then at the bottom, I just have do's and don'ts for each sort of phase. I won't go through them all, but I'll just say for this first one, the big do is rest. The big don't is don't do anything intense. For the 8 to 14 phase, integration and therapy is an amazing thing to do. A big don't is don't make big plans. And don't do any old habits or just be an awful person, because you're going to have maladaptive plasticity. In other words, the double-edged sword of Iboga. In the 15 to 30, this is if you want to pick up microdosing, a great time to do it. And I'll show a slide why. And if you're not ready, don't pick up microdosing. Like if you feel good, right? So it's a double one here. You have to have discernment in this. And in the 1 month, do keep reinforcing, build community, use SMART goals, and you'll have that integration packet. And don't start chasing peaks in this phase. This is the one thing that will get people caught up, is you'll get to the 30 days, you'll feel great, and now you'll want another experience. Just keep it going from there. So I'm going to talk about microdosing post-retreat, and I'm going to use David R. Hawkins' sort of scale of consciousness to frame it, because we have to have some sort of like XY axis to make this make sense. So just remember, for David R. Hawkins, he has this sort of scale of consciousness. He says that shame is the lowest and sort of enlightenment is the highest. This region is a spiritual paradigm. this is a reason and integrity, and this is a survival paradigm. It's actually a really beautiful process, and he developed this through muscle testing, by the way. He has 2 books, Force versus Power and Letting Go, the Pathway of Surrender, if you want to know about this more. So we're using this consciousness scale as sort of our y-axis, and then the bottom is sort of your days, right? And so you have this pre-Iboga time down here, and this is your starting baseline, and so we're calling it a consciousness level. And again, we're just referring to a consciousness level here. I'm not going to say specifically what type, but you get the point. So we have a starting consciousness baseline that we come into the retreat at, right? Now we have our 2 ceremonies. Remember, we're going to have that peak. We're going to have a little bit of a dip. We're going to have another peak for the second ceremony. It's going to spike our consciousness up. Why? Because, as you know, when you eat Iboga, you're getting insights and this sort of awareness and knowing that's like almost nothing else. That's why people come to it. And so you are moving into these higher consciousness levels, right? And now what's going to happen is naturally they're going to start to drop. There's going to be a balancing that takes place. And then what you're going to have is a new baseline consciousness. If you sort of keep to your spiritual practice after. If you do BS, it's going to drop lower to where it's from before. I've literally seen that happen first person. So this is going to create a new baseline for yourself, and you're going to have a new sort of baseline consciousness level, according to David R. Hawkins, which is a great thing. So where does the microdosing or macrodosing post-retreat come in, and why would it be beneficial? So the red line is representing the Iboga you're going to macrodose after, and the purple line is going to represent sort of your new consciousness level. So you macrodose Iboga, and you have this new conscious level, which picks back up, right? Because you have, remember we talked about the introspection phase we're sort of activating that again. And then what's going to happen is going to be a natural tapering, and there's going to be a new baseline formed. The beautiful of stacking it after a big journey, and this is why we recommend it to people, is because you're going to create a new delta in your baseline. Delta just means change, difference. So on a regular journey, you would sort of stabilize and have some sort of resting baseline, which would be elevated from your original. But when you stack it with macrodosing after, you're essentially giving yourself an opportunity for another open critical period, which would allow you to even go deeper in your spiritual practice. And so this is just sort of a visual representation of what's happening when you start from no Iboga to ingesting it, to using a macrodose around the 14 to 21 day mark. This is about 14 days after. You can do it anywhere in that range. It's right for you. But to do it in that mark is the sweet spot. It's going to pick that back up. And again, we're just using this David R. Hawkins scale as something to frame it. This is a cool video. I just want to see it real quick. I actually didn't know this was in there. And so what do we do with these windows, right? This is the one of the big parts of the presentation. The first thing to do is gratitude conditioning. And I say conditioning because literally what you're doing is just conditioning your brain to be a brain of gratitude. And if we go back to that consciousness scale real quick, if you look up here, he doesn't have it on this one, but gratitude is one of the higher frequencies he has in his book, Letting Go, the Pathway of Surrender. So it's a very high consciousness state for him. Joe Dispenza says it all the time. Gratitude is the ultimate state of receivership. Right. And the reason Joe Dispenza is doing it is because he says if you're grateful, it means you've received something. And so if you're carrying the frequency of gratitude, what happens is the universe says, oh, you've received something. Let me give you something. That's the law of cause and effect, or law of attraction. So one thing I do is every day I wake up, I still do this every single day of my life, no matter how fucking tired I am or what I have to do. I smile, I open my eyes, I smile, and out loud, I say, I'm alive. And I just sit for a second in the simple fact that I get to be alive and just find gratitude for that fundamental thing. And I do that every day. And I promise you, after a while, you're going to start believing it and you just become happy to just simply be alive. Another thing to do is, little baby smiling at me, way too cute. Another thing is self-conditioning, self-love conditioning. And so I don't know if anyone's have known this, but if you brush your teeth with your offhand, you'll be tapping into your subconscious mind in the morning. So what you do is you brush your teeth with your offhand, you look on the mirror and you say, I love you. Another guy who tried this, he said, I love you today more than I did yesterday. And he would just do that every single day over and over and over until your brain literally is wired that way, right? What we're doing is hacking the brain to stop suffering and getting it to start loving itself. And going back to the car analogy, What if instead of learning to drive a car became automated? What if self-love became automated? So when you ask me, how am I doing? I say I'm perfect. It's because I've just conditioned myself to understand that I'm perfect. Even if it's a shitty day, or I just stepped in dog shit, or whatever could possibly happen, I still know I'm perfect. And I've just conditioned my brain to be that way. So these are two really good practices. Another one to do is to start working with energy healing modalities, or to just clearing your space, having an awareness of subtle energy fields in your life. Why? Because now the brain starts to form pathways around being connected to the subtle fields of energy. Same exact thing. We're just using this idea of conditioning to support our lives. Another thing to do is to have an altar. Why? Because there's a Zen Buddhist quote. You can see it down here. And these are from the integration packets we'll send out. So if you have this, I'll send you a PDF with all of this. A man's mind is only as clear as the water is on his altar. It's a Zen Buddhist phrase. And what they're really saying is that if you spend every day giving attention to an altar, to your ancestors, like Jo does, she brings honey to the altar, or chocolates, or sometimes alcohol, you're rewiring your brain to be connected to the ancestral realm, to the spiritual dimension. It's not a difficult thing. This is why we're saying spirituality is a way of being. It's not something you have to do, right? Once you have that wiring right and you start living that way, it just becomes how you are. Another really, really powerful thing, and this is an integration packet, which I'll send you, the Isha Kriya by Sadhguru. It's basically 48 days once a day, or 90 days once a day, or 48 days twice a day. And he's going to have you do a practice where you're going to repeat, I am not the body, I am not the mind. I am not the body, I am not the mind. You're going to do it over and over and over, and it is transformational. So if you go to work with Iboga, or you macrodose, or work with any psychedelic, because we know they all open a window, do this afterwards. And watch what's going to happen. You're going to start to have this deep-seated, constant awareness that you're not your body and you're not your mind. This is this type of stuff these ancient teachers are striving to teach us, but the problem is we read it in a book and then we go intellectualize it. We don't practice it. And so this is an opportunity to take these into practice. Another thing is he has a course, Sadhguru, it's called Inner Engineering. It's really cheap. It's an online course, and it teaches you how to engineer your inner self. So another thing you can do, and I only have a few more, is something, I love this one. It's about concentration. And so according to Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, he says you actually cannot meditate. It's impossible, because meditation is an effortless action. What he says you can do, however, is you can concentrate. And when you sustain that concentration for an extended period of time, meditation is the natural byproduct of that. And so one of the easiest ways to do it is just light a flame on a candle and sit there in a dark room and set a timer for 5 minutes and just concentrate on the flame. Just do that. That alone, after you work with psychedelics or Iboga and plant sacraments, is going to help conform your brain to be a concentration device. And the interesting thing about this, remember we talked about earlier about the unmanifest, those 3 gunas? So according to Patanjali, right now, each of us are in this place called the manifest, or creation, or the Purusha. The Prakriti. And he has a process he teaches called Sampranjita Samadhi, which is distinguished contemplation, and it takes you from the manifest to the unmanifest. This is what the sutras are about right here. And this is the exact process you go through. First, what you do is you concentrate on a gross element. That is a flame. And he says what's going to happen is when you concentrate on something, you and that thing are going to merge and become one. The observer and the observed become one. If you read David R. Hawkins' Letting Go, the Pathway of Surrender, this is his entire book, what he's trying to teach you about. So you hear the flame there. First, they're separate, but with concentration, meditation occurs. That means the two have merged. Now there's no more flame. The next thing you're going to do is focus on a subtle element, which could be like a thought or an idea or a belief. At first, there's you and there's the belief. What's going to happen with staying concentration? They merge into one. Next, you do that to the mind, then to individuality, then the ego. And after that, you're going to find yourself in the unmanifest. And so this process of staring at a candle is literally the guide way to move through these layers according to Patanjali. And you can find this in the sutras. In the book I just wrote, I name all the sutras where he talks about this. Another thing you can do is learn an instrument, something simple. A native flute is a really great way. It's really easy to learn. It's going to be an amazing thing to do with the neuroplasticity. Juggling is another one. And then pick 1 to 2 books that are meaningful to you and just read those 2 books over and over and over again. Don't read a book and a book and a book and a book and a book, because you're not going to retain anything. You only retain about 10% of what you read, 20% of what you listen to, 30% of what you read and listen to, and it's like 65% of what you teach. So what I say is read a book 3 times, read it, study it, and then teach it to yourself. And what's going to happen is you're going to retain all of the information from it. So if you read Many Lives, Many Masters once, you might be like, oh, that was a really beautiful book. Now, if you study it, it's going to add another layer. And now if you teach it to yourself, it's going to be an ingrained part of your thinking process. The awareness of a soul is always going to be there. So when a life event happens to you, the filter in which that is moved through is going to have this sort of awareness into it. The book I wrote is literally just all about that. That's the point of the book I wrote. Yeah. But these are all some really good ones. The Gita is great. Power of Now, obviously, Let It Go. These are just some really good ones. Another one, really incredible. And there's only one more after this, I promise. Bhakti yoga is the pathway of devotion. If you've ever seen a Hare Krishna monk, they'll sit there with this mala and they'll count the mala over reciting this mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. A friend of mine is a Bhakti monk. So Bhakti is one of the paths of devotion. And so what you can do is you can get a mala and just sit there and go round and round. But all you have to do is say, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I do that. If you see me in ceremonies, I have my mala with me everywhere I go. I do it all the time ever since I met my friend who's a monk. He gave me the mala, and the bag you can buy is called a japa. The japa is meant to be your heart. And so what I do is I take the mala, I put my prayer into it by blowing into it. Let's say my prayer is that everyone on this call has abundance and success in life. I'll think that into the mala. I'll place the mala into the japa, which is my heart. And then I'll start doing rounds and rounds and rounds the way he's doing it there. Now, I did the math so you can understand why this works so much. Oh, and Joe brought this over. This is a picture of her japa and her mala. And so what I would do is I would take this, I would say my prayer to it. I would feed it into my heart very carefully. Think of it like planting a seed in the soil of your heart. And then you hold it in a certain way and you start doing your mantra. And for me, I would just say, thank you, thank you, thank you. Or I had a woman we were working with recently. And honestly, she was very, very difficult. Lovely, lovely woman, but very difficult. And I realized that when I would speak to her in the ceremony, it was being used to sort of reinforce these beliefs and narratives. So what I did was I stopped speaking. I sat next to her and I just prayed for her, going round and round and round with my mala. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing tool. And why does it work for the Bhakti monks? Why do they find bliss? There's 108 beads in this mala. And the mantra they're doing, the Hare Krishna, is a 16-word mantra. They do it about 16 times a day at minimum. That's 1,728 chants per day. Multiply that by a year, and that's 630,720 chants a year. Now, they're saying Hare over 5 million times, Krishna and Rama over 2.5 million times in a year at minimum. Why is that important? Hare is talking about Shakti, the Supreme Lord's divine energy. Krishna, the God, is the all-attractive one, and Rama is the reservoir of all pleasure. So imagine how many times these people are using these powerful words to reinforce their brain. It's literally brainwashing yourself into bliss. So the first thing I do if I work with you as a client, I'm going to tell you to get a mala and a japa and start working with it. It's a beautiful, beautiful practice. And the Bhakti monks know exactly what they're doing. And the reason 16 is because, I forgot what it said at the bottom. Yeah, there's 16 divine qualities of Krishna. That's why the 16 is the minimum number. But I've been to a Bhakti temple and they're blissed out, man. They're incredible. And I saw what it did to them. I just took it and applied it to a way that's more applicable in my life. I'm not going to do 16 rounds a day. It's not happening. And the next one, karma yoga, the path of selfless service. Another thing to do, read the Gita a bunch of times and start doing good deeds and good acts, and you'll reinforce that into your brain. And then the very last one I want to talk about is, to me, the most important. And what I do with Iboga and the synaptic pruning and all of that is I teach the mind nothing. All of these things are great and they're all helpful. But what I do with this is I teach the mind neutrality. Going back to those very first few slides we talked about Buddha nature, about in Zen, about the Egyptian Book of the Dead, that's literally what I do with the neuroplasticity of Iboga. The reason why is because neutrality is the only place that's free from polarity. Remember that Ram Dass song, beyond all polarities, I am. Let the judgments and opinions of the mind be the judgments and opinions of the mind, and you exist beyond that. The only place unconditional love can exist is in neutrality. There's no conditions, right? You can't have peace without war. You can't have love without hate. And so to have peace means you had war. Neutrality is the only place free from that. It's why that was the Buddha's first teaching. And what I do with that is I use this neutrality in another way that the Toltec frame, where they say that each brick you carry is a belief that you have in your life, and the concrete is the faith that holds it all together. And then they have the dream of the first attention, the second, and the third. But the reason I say this is because when I studied with them and I talked to the son, I asked them about these 3 dreams of attention, which we don't need to talk about right now. But I asked them, what happens if you keep dismantling, right? Because the dream of the first attention is a dream that you're conditioned to be. Like when I grew up, I was forced to have a dream of my attention was first forced to place in the foster home. And what I learned there was that relationships weren't safe. And so I built a structure, which was my physical reality now of beliefs, that relationships aren't safe. So if I got a dog, like when I first got Blue, I wouldn't be close with him because my belief structure said that I'm going to lose him in 7 to 10 years. I'm already preparing for his death. So why get close? Remember, in the foster home with me, the kids would come and go. So I'd make a friend and they'd be gone the next week and then I'd cry. After a while, you stop making friends. So the Toltec believe is that this is how our reality is created, through beliefs. And then once some of us dismantle this first attention, which isn't our choice, we enter the dream of the second attention, which is where do we choose to place our beliefs? So now I have a belief in my structure is that relationships are beautiful things to make. It's still a belief, but it's a much more positive one, right? And then you can enter the dream of the third attention, which means you destroy the second structure. And now the bricks are no longer about your life, they're about others, which goes back to selfless service, right? And so I asked the Toltec guys, well, what happens if you destroy the third? And he said it would become more pure. And I said, what if you destroy the fourth and the fifth and the sixth and the seventh and the eighth and the ninth? And what he said to me is that's what the Nagual does. In other words, what he said is that's what the shaman does. Think about it. If this belief structure is your mind, your reality, you're limited by this structure, no matter how beautiful it is. But what he said was the shaman doesn't have a structure. And so what I use Iboga for is to dismantle the structure. That's what I do with it. And what I would encourage you to do is if you're interested in walking that path, use Iboga for this and start to remove all the beliefs that you carry, all of them. And what you're going to start finding is your brain's going to rest in a state of neutrality, and there's going to be no suffering in that. You're still going to be able to see positive. You're still going to be able to see negative. You're still going to have emotions, but it's going to be a total tranquility you're going to find. And like I said, we have a course where we help people move through this if you're interested. And so, yeah, that's it. Question and answer time. I tried to keep this as short as possible. I'm sorry that I didn't. Let me hit stop sharing. How do I do that? Did I stop sharing it? Cool. I tried to rush at the end, so I apologize for speaking fast. Is there anyone who has any questions, any comments, anything you would like to ask or say or share?
Well, it was definitely fantastic. Thank you, Troy.
You're welcome. I don't know who said that, but
Um,
oh, Steve.
yeah. So you're sending out a PDF of this, is that correct?
You'll get a
Because
PDF of this.
oh,
You'll have the whole
yeah,
presentation, and then we're going to send. When you come to our retreats, you get an integration, a booklet. It's 90 pages, prep work, the whole
yep,
retreat flow, and the post
yep,
part. I'm going to send the
uh-huh,
integration portion of that too. It has like SMART goals, 30-day
yeah,
prayer
yeah.
trackers, all this kind of stuff.
Okay. The reason I was asking is because having your small image superimposed covered up some of the text.
Yeah,
So I
dude.
assume
Sorry about that.
the PDF won't have that.
Hopefully not, man. I don't think anybody wants
As
that.
much as I love looking at you, seriously.
Yeah, no, it won't have that. PDF will be clean. Yeah, definitely won't
Okay.
have that, man. And Joe will send that out. We'll make sure it's all attached and everything.
Yeah. Great. There was
Right.
also an a QR code on one of the. Oh, I'm trying to think of which one it was.
Yeah, it's for the donation page. That will take you to our nonprofit's website.
Okay. Okay.
If you want to make a donation to that
Yeah.
specific fund. Yeah,
All right. Thank you.
yeah, thank you.
I
You're
do.
welcome. I got you, Mike, Dr. Mike. You hear that? I said you're welcome. Yes.
I would love to hear more at some point, Troy, and we can talk, you know, at some other time about the equine therapy because I think you've known. I've gone to a couple of equine assisted therapy at a ranch in Montana that supports veterans, and would love to hear more about that aspect that you guys are doing too.
Yeah. Let's definitely check. I know we already had an initial conversation a while ago, so yeah, we can definitely follow up on that.
Hey Troy, quick question for you
What's
about
up, dude?
uh, what's up, man? Thank you for the shout out.
Of course, brother.
Yeah. So when we go like on a hike and we take a little bit of Iboga, and it's kind of in that personal to ceremonial or not ceremonial range, but maybe therapeutic. So between personal and therapeutic, where would you kind of if you were going to take a little bit before a hike, where would your dose kind of be for something like that?
I mean, hold on. Let me hit stop recording real quick. Let me, yeah.